Hello, my name is Cheryl Drool, and welcome to the 23rd Annual Fall for the Book Festival. These are free online events. They run the last 2 weeks of October, and you can always rewatch them on Crowdcast or YouTube. You can follow on Crowdcast by clicking on the Fall for the Book link and then clicking follow, or you can follow on YouTube, and the link will be in the chat. I'm an associate professor at George Mason in the School of Business, and I teach and study technology, innovation, and supply chain management. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Azeem Azhar, the author of The Exponential Age, How Accelerating Technology is Transforming Business, Politics, and Society. Yeah, we all have our book.
I've got to do it.
He also has a fascinating podcast, The Exponential View, and he's the founder and investor of many successful tech companies, is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council. He writes for many publications, and he serves as the Economist's first ever internet correspondent. Welcome, Azeem.
Thank you so much for having me. And I actually love the title of this this whole series, Fall for the Book, because the play on words is just beautiful.
Yes, it's very nice to have such a good series. So Azeem, I'm looking forward to our discussion. And audience, please put any questions for Azeem into the Crowdcast Q&A section. So Azeem, to start us off and to give our audience some context, can you please give us a brief description of an exponential technology and why we should be interested in them?
Let's start with the one that we are most familiar with, even if we don't think about it, which is computing. I'm holding up my iPhone here. An exponential technology is one that gets significantly cheaper on a compounded basis every year for decades. And if we think about digital computing, we use it all the time. We probably don't think that we're using digital computing that often. It's a comparatively recent part of our economies, of our daily lives. And the core atom of a digital computer, the fundamental thing that we need is called a transistor. And in 1958, IBM bought some transistors from a company called Fairchild Semiconductor. And in real terms, the 100 or so transistors they bought would today cost about $1,000 each. Now, in a smartphone, mine is a couple of years old, there are tens of billions of transistors, and we've driven the price of transistors down to fractions of a hundredths of a millionth of a cent. I mean, it's such a hard number to think of mathematically. It's actually harder to say in words. And what we've done is we've taken this rare technology, one that IBM and the US military was using in the 1950s to do things like model atomic bomb blasts and made it incredibly pervasive, incredibly quotidian, so much so that we have billions of transistors in silicon chips lying around in kitchen drawers everywhere because it's our old Android devices we no longer use. The reason we should care is that as this technology becomes pervasive, we can start to do really, really interesting things with it. And we live on the tail end of 50 years of exponential improvements in computing, and we think nothing to doing things that would have been perceived as magic even by the most advanced university researchers only 10 years ago.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's been amazing. So, you mentioned digital computing as sort of the example, right? And we often think of internet computing and digital technology. But you highlight in your book the role of manufacturing, standardized parts, shipping containers, 3D printing. How are those critical for the exponential age?
Well, I think we have to understand what is it that drives the price of these technologies to come down. And I tell the story. I didn't put it in the book. I wish I had. It's a great story, but I will share it with you, which is that during pandemic lockdown, I think many of us turned to baking because we had nothing else to do. And the first loaf of sourdough bread you make spills loads of flour everywhere. It doesn't taste very good. And frankly, it's kind of a mess. But by the time you make your 8th loaf, so you're 4 weeks into pandemic lockdown, you're getting really good and you're really efficient at it. And that's happening because of learning. And with these technologies, whether it is silicon chips and our ability to make them better, or read the human genome, we get better through our learning. And that learning rate in these technologies happens to be quite high. What drives the learning? What drives the learning is our ability to produce these things. The more the engineers make, just like you and your partner making sourdough bread during lockdown, every subsequent loaf is made more efficiently and tastier and uses less material. And that's essentially been one of the key drivers, that idea of the learning rate. It was a relationship that was identified by an aeronautical engineer in 1936, Theodore Wright. But to your point, other things have helped. And so one of the things that has really helped has been the arrival of standardization. What standardization does is it means that you can use the same technology in lots of different areas. You create more experience because we're putting the technology not just to model atomic bomb blasts, but to pay payrolls. And those other customers create more demand and they ask for new features, and that helps the engineers improve the technologies much more so. So standardization has been really important. And then the third area is how do you ultimately accelerate demand? And it's no surprise to me that alongside the drumbeat of these exponential technologies, intimately connected has been the arrival of the internet that has made it easier for us to share our learnings, and the arrival of global supply chains that has vastly expanded that demand. In other words, vastly expanded the demand for sourdough loaves in the fields of manufacturing and biology and energy, and therefore help drive down prices. Not from an economies of scale perspective, that happens as well, but from fundamentally how well we know how to make these things.
And so do you think we're actually learning at a faster rate with these exponential technologies than we did, 100 years ago when learning curve was discovered? Or is it simply because of this global demand that's driving the learning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's both things. So we haven't really come across, until we came across silicon chips, things that improved at 40 to 45% per annum for the same dollar cost every year for 60 years. I mean, car engines didn't do that. The printing press didn't do that. The wheel almost certainly didn't do that. And they may have had moments, right, where there were a few years where they improved very, very rapidly because there were easy gains. But this sort of constant range for 50 years is quite something else. And I think that it's unique at this moment in time. It also relates, I think, to the sophistication and the complexity of the economy. So many of the listeners may have heard of something called Moore's law. So Moore's law was a descriptor that the co-founder of Intel came up with in the 60s. He realized that we were able to put more transistors on a silicon wafer. That's what makes a silicon chip. And the more you got on there, the cheaper effectively the chips became for the same price. And that is connected somehow to ultimately the physics of chips, because we can only make things so small, right? Atoms are atoms. And so for about a decade, people have been saying, well, Moore's law is going to die. It's going to be too hard. The physics is going to get in the way. And certainly we ran into a number of issues. But here was a fascinating thing about the exponential age, which was that about a decade ago, about the same sort of time that people were worrying about the decline of Moore's law, we had some independent breakthroughs in what we now call AI. And that AI needed so much computing power, much, much more than the beautiful drumbeat of Moore's law was ever going to provide. And the industry, the semiconductor companies, the computer companies were able to respond to that. And they did it with new innovations that delivered even more processing power for less cost, but they didn't rely on the tricky physics of miniaturization of Moore's law. They actually used different approaches that I talk about in chapter 1 of the book. And I think that to your question of have we seen this before and is this different? We haven't seen this before. It is different. And even when we look at this very, very well held belief that we'd reach limits of Moore's law, what showed up was an alternative way to deliver the exponential performance gains in computing, which is what we saw with all these cool AI chips.
Yes. So you talk a little bit about, the S-curve of technologies, right? Where they increase, rapidly improve, and then they level off. And so, clearly we've sort of jumped from S-curve to S-curve. And I always think that, an easy way to explain that is, we went from records to 8-track tapes to cassette tapes to CDs to digital music, right? And it's a similar idea where we keep jumping S-curves.
You're talking about my Bee Gees collection there, I think, because I've owned my Bee Gees Saturday Night Fever album on about 5 different formats, different S-curves each time. Yeah.
Yes, and probably your computers as well.
Yes.
And so we seem to keep jumping S-curves. And do you think we're going to continue to do that? It sounds like it, right? With various things. And the other thing you mentioned is sort of this combining of technologies. Is that going to be impacted? Part of this?
Yeah. Well, a turkey always has a great, great life running up to the day before Thanksgiving. And one has to be a bit careful about what we say here. But there is, we've knocked down a lot of hurdles in that time. And we keep seeming to be able to layer S-curves on, and we have done historically for tens of thousands of years. And there's a futurist called Ray Kurzweil who, in some cases I disagree with what he says, but he has made the case about 20 years ago that this layering of S-curves appears to happen. And it certainly seems to be the case within, or certainly kind of computing and some of the other domains. And then the question is, do things like combinations really help? And my sense is that they absolutely do help. So if we again just look at the computing arena, you take a technology like deep learning, which is this funky new AI system that came out about a decade ago, and we've started to use deep learning not just in helping computers look at images, but we use it to generate text, we use it to control renewable power systems, we're using it to help self-driving cars in certain ways. So it's got all of these different applications coming in because it's a rather standard technology. What that's then doing is that it's creating this additional demand for computer cycles, and entrepreneurs and businesses are responding to it. And the fascinating thing, Cheryl, is that in the 5 years between 2013 and 2018, the amount of computer cycles that the most sophisticated deep learning systems needed increased 300,000 times. So that's how much, it's not quite how much energy they needed, but it's a 300,000-fold improvement in just 5 years. Again, it's really hard for us to get our heads around that, but it does play back to this idea that actually in this new environment where our economies are quite complex and people are quite sophisticated about how they use the tools and the learning can take place and the signals can go to the businesses, that we can actually respond to these sorts of opportunities, perhaps in a way that we wouldn't have done 100 years ago.
Interesting. So I was also looking at the section about food production, and I think it was kind of interesting to think about agriculture is usually, you know, traditional, slow, right? Even if that's not true, right? There's quite a bit of technology in what we think of as large-scale farming today. How is it that food production is becoming an exponential technology, and what impact will that have on our eating, our sourdough, as well as on, you know, society?
If we think about where food production is, certainly in richer Western countries that are highly urbanized, food production has been gone through the same mass production industrialization genie that car production went through. It's no longer artisanal, it's very, very large scale, so much so that big food often doesn't want us going into their combined animal feeding operations, their CAFOs at all. Like, it's sort of held behind a sort of veil of secrecy. And a lot of our food is optimized nowadays for efficiency, and it's optimized for the supply chain. I mean, fundamentally, when I'm living in the United Kingdom, in London, when I order tomatoes from my online supermarket, quite often they're still in the ground somewhere in Spain, or not in the ground, they're sort of hanging above the ground somewhere in Spain, and then they make their way over to me. And so that fruit has grown to survive a 4-day journey. And so that's where we've ended up, and it's done amazing things to sort of feed us. What we can start to do with a combination of exponential technologies is deliver high intensity localized farming. This idea is that of the vertical farms. You take a field, you slice it up into 12 or 13 stories of height. You use genomics and sequencing to figure out what are the best attributes of the plants. You use machine learning to figure out when they need to be watered, when they need light. You figure out which frequencies of light stimulate them the best. You figure out when to strain them using cold spells, because plants need strain in order to be vibrant and full of nutrition. And you run the whole thing hydroponically or aeroponically. The entire gamut, which is this set of combinations of these amazing exponential technologies, uses 80% less water, produces more nutritious food, and the lettuces roll off the vertical farm straight onto the Kroger lettuce rack at the front of the supermarket. And I think what's quite interesting about that is we now then grow the food for the nutrition, and we are able to go through many, many crop cycles in a year. So that the fascinating thing here is that a vertical farm might turn over crop cycles 10 times faster than a traditional farmer thinking about regenerative mechanisms using soil. And that means that these digital farmers are learning really quickly. They're getting 10 years worth of experience every year. That means more nutritious food, potentially. It's more expensive right now, but cost curves will come down. But the other thing to think about is that it could be the first time since humans settled in cities in Gorani Tepe in Turkey 12,000 years ago that a city could produce its own food. Because cities have always relied on the countryside, and they've been vulnerable to that. Think of the siege of Troy, to being able to access their own food. And this, given that we're an urbanizing species, I think is a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, the vertical farms are fascinating. And the idea of getting food optimized for nutrition as opposed to the supply chain and transportation, will be a big difference. So the one thing we haven't talked about at all are network effects, right?
Yeah.
This increasing returns to scale idea. And so they've really led to the superstar companies that you talk about in your book, like Facebook, Google, Alphabet. Will companies of the future really need to have some economies of scale to be successful, right? Is that going to be like a requirement of your product?
Well, I think the challenge that companies will face will be that first of all, they have to find their way out into the market. And we've seen in certain areas there is a sclerotic effect of these very, very large companies. They're able to suck margin out of the publishing industry or out of retail or out of advertising. So I think that is a challenge that they have to contend with. But then the second question is, where does your competitive advantage start to come from, and does it really come from scale? In the last 40 years, one of the fascinating shifts in the sources of corporate value is that the value of companies has gone from tangible assets, tractors, inventories in the warehouse, buildings, things that if you punched, you would hurt your hand, to intangible assets. That's know-how, customer data, brand. And that shift makes us look at the value of physical assets, whether it's sort of physical factories and so on, in a different way. Coming back to our dear old iPhone, the $1,000 iPhone has about $200 or $300 worth of manufactured products in it. The rest of it is Apple's je ne sais quoi, and that's why it's a $2.5 trillion company. There are clearly benefits of scale that come from that, but the actual value that can be created is now often going to be created in the know-how and the designs. And so I think the model that you're starting to see is one where the group that understands how to bring these intangible assets together, which includes the network effects that have made Facebook so powerful or Google so powerful, can do so without enormous capital expenses. And the model that you have in Apple, which is essentially Apple takes all the profit and gives a small, thin patina layer to Foxconn and Pegatron, whoever make their products, is one that we might start to see becoming more common in other areas.
So one of the conversations around the pandemic has been, bringing more manufacturing back to the US or Western Europe, right? Closer to where the demand is. But this would seem to argue against certainly companies bringing back manufacturing internally, where it's still going to be outsourced to those other companies. And so any thoughts on what you're going to see there?
Yeah, it's a really complicated pattern. It's a little bit like the weather in the Netherlands, where there are 4 or 5 different cold fronts that come in, and that's why it has such changeable weather. Or San Francisco's weather, where you get 4 seasons in one day. So what are the forces back and forth? I mean, one of the forces is rising labor costs in the countries where manufacturing is happening. A second force is an improvement in factory automation, which essentially means that labor costs are less important in places like the US. And there are exponential technologies like 3D printing that are really, really nascent, but are improving at 30% per annum, that could allow you to have localized manufacturing certainly for components. I mean, we're well away from being able to 3D print an iPhone. Let's be clear about that. But then there are also the issues that I touch on in the book around national security, and the sense that technology is becoming more and more strategically important. And so you want to be able to have sort of eyes on where these chips and phones and cars are being built. And so what we've seen in the year or so since I finished the book and it was published a couple of months ago, is increasing investments in physical factories that are local. The first chip factory is being built in America for 20 years. The first chip factory is being built in Europe really forever. iPhones being manufactured for the Indian market in India. Now, in many cases, the factories are owned by the Taiwanese manufacturer, but the production has become more and more local, and these products are not going to cross national lines. So, my view about the exponential age is that while it doesn't mark the end of globalization, what it does mark are headwinds against a simplistic narrative that we can just build these enormous supply chains and let things happen wherever they are, because there's too much pressure from a national security perspective, from wage prices on the one hand, and the opportunity of automation and exponential technologies that allow you to do things locally. Those will create headwinds. It would slow down the trend that we had been on.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Yeah, it's a internal question whether we go local, global, back and forth. So you mentioned labor, right? Clearly we see an increase of pressure on wages right now. We have the Great Resignation. We've seen a lot of strikes recently, right? And more labor movements. What benefits are there for labor in the exponential age?
This is a really tricky one. Technology is could help Labour. Historically, they've taken a long time to help Labour. And when England was industrializing at the end of during the 19th century, for about 50 or 60 years, economic productivity went up, GDP went up really quickly, and workers' wages didn't. And then that led to organized trade unions and a lot of labor pressure, the arrival of labor-based politics, and then a new wage settlement. It took about 60 or 70 years. And Frederick Engels, who was a collaborator of Karl Marx, identified this. It was later called the Engels pause. And it seems like we're going through a similar process now. So since the 1970s, if you look at the United States, the economy has got much, much more technological, much more advanced, much more use of IT and automation. And in that period, the share of national income that goes to the workers rather than the capital has fallen significantly. It's fallen by about 10 percentage points. And that's happened over that sort of 45-year period and speeding up recently. It's not all to do with technology. About 2/3 of that is to do with the sort of fundamental drivers of technology or the business models that emerge from it that I discuss in the book. So while technologies can improve things for labor, whether they do or not...
Was that visible?
Oh, sorry. Whether they do or not is often related to what the politics allows for. And all of this has happened, as I think we all know, at the point at which there was this bonfire of regulations. It was Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan in the US. And so in a sense, the kind of political pendulum swung very, very far away from Labour. And now it seems to be swinging back towards Labour at a moment where there are these technologies that can really potentially improve the quality of work. Whether they do or not is not down to the technologists. It's going to be down to whether we can get a fair labour bargain. And that is probably down to the Great Resignation and how effective these strikes end up being.
Yeah, so you brought up regulation. Obviously, one of the big parts about your book is this exponential gap, right? So can you talk a little bit about the exponential gap and what can citizens do to help try and close that gap?
The exponential gap is, I think it's a neat device to help us understand all these different things that are going on. And I'm sure that many people listening have been overwhelmed over the last 4 years, possibly to the point of boredom or tears, just how much frustrating things are happening around technology right now. And the reason is that the technologies sort of grow across this curve, and TikTok shows up. We've never heard of it, and then suddenly it's invaded our lives everywhere. But we as individuals are not well primed to watch these very fast moving changes and adjust to them. And our social institutions, whether it's the customs of, is it reasonable to be on your iPhone when you're in church on a Sunday, to can you say what you like on social media, through to, is a large company that owns 85% of the search engine market, a market that didn't exist 20 years ago, a monopolist or not, right? These are all examples of institutions that can't ask the right questions in the face of rapid technology change. And so that I call the exponential gap. It's a sort of line of, I've got to try and work out how to do this on the camera, but the technology going up and the line of institutions moving more slowly. And what I would hope to do with the book is to help people who are building technologies to understand the second and third order effects of what they do. And for the rest of us to understand how the technologies behave, why they behave the way they do, and what the right questions are to ask of the world, the technology industry as such. As to what we can individually do, I think that's so context dependent. I have a platform, I can talk to people, I can influence people that way. I think individually this does require a little bit of political participation and activism. It's not going to be sufficient to just hit, skip intro on Netflix, play later, right? You've got to go a little bit further than that and start to ask the right questions, almost at the right level, whether it's at the school board level, whether it's just the conversations you have with your family and friends, whether it's petitioning your local politician. I think the more well-equipped we are to ask the right questions, the more we can shape the closing of that gap.
So given I work at a university, what do you see as the things that we should be doing in education, whether, primary or university education, to really allow people to ask those questions?
It's sort of such a great place to be working. First of all, I think it's a really, really important time for education, and I need to be clear about what I say now, because I don't fully understand what's happening in the US, and I know that the battles in the US are they're often sort of tied around this kind of polarization question and who's allowed to speak and who isn't. So, with that caveat that I'm sort of out of my swim lane for those issues, the challenge here is that things are moving very, very quickly, and there is a requirement for being able to understand what I would call the skills of metacognition, right? Thinking about thinking, and the way in which we need to adjust for potentials, for things that are certainly unheard or unsaid. And that, I think, means an understanding of skills of criticality, statistical thinking, probabilistic thinking, amongst other things. And I don't think it's straightforward, but it is it's a path that we have to go down. I'm really sorry about the background. I've got some engineers working on my broadband, but we'll keep them in the background for now.
No problem. So audience, I just want to remind you, if you have questions for Azeem, please put them into the Q&A function. So yeah, we're working hard to help students learn how to think and to be critical thinkers and reasoners. That's important. One of the things that you do suggest to help address the exponential gap is think about championing a digital data bill of rights. So how close do you think something like the GDPR is for that? And do we have a long way to go?
Yeah. So the idea behind the digital Bill of Rights is just that with these technologies, we've created new types of risks and new types of opportunities. And the risks are about the way in which we as private citizens, most importantly, can be manipulated either by governments applying these technologies or private companies applying these technologies. So we need protections. And those protections might simply be things like, because of the way algorithms work now, I can predict your behavior even if I don't have your data, because I have the data of all of your friends. And that can be invasive on you. So that's the sort of important driver for it. GDPR, which is a European regulation, I think goes quite far in helping us protect the citizens' rights and access to non-discrimination and so on. But it wasn't designed to do that. So I think where we need to go is something that Eleanor Roosevelt achieved in 1947 with the UN Convention, UNHCR Declaration, which is something that is a little bit totemic, that manages to get people together, even though many countries didn't agree with these universal values, and that has a story and a narrative around it that we can all hang around. I mean, people fight for the UNHCR, and they have fought for it, and they have committed their lives to it. Privacy legislation is important, but it just doesn't feel as appealing as something that has got that totem of being a Bill of Rights. And so perhaps it's about optics, but I think it is something that would capture the fact that we're in a new land.
Interesting. So you mentioned algorithms there. So it seems that we have these increasingly complicated, as you mentioned, everything's complicated, algorithms, artificial intelligence, deep learning, right? And it seems that, often the people who write the initial code, it goes off and learned, and something comes out at the other end they weren't expecting, right? So you mentioned transparency as an important part of figuring out what's going on with these exponential technologies, getting people to release their code, et cetera. If we can't understand what the algorithms are doing in the end, how is that transparency going to make a difference?
We're in an emerging world where the engineering is quite new, and we've established standards for how we test things like automobiles and aircraft and everyone who builds them has to stick to those standards. When we look at these algorithmic systems, they are no doubt complex, but right now there are no standards against which they are judged. And so we're starting to see things that people in the social sciences and humanities will have warned of for decades, which is that the data reflects the biases of the world as it was, and now they're being turned into software code. And in the last year, we've seen researchers identify, for example, that you can predict the race and the ethnicity of someone from a medical image that goes through a machine vision system, because embedded in the data, the fact that we've got more data about people of European origin than of Afro-Caribbean origin, are these biases, and they can be pulled out by these systems. So the thing that we need to do is establish a much, much greater degree of understanding of what's going into the system, what is being tested for, how have reliability tests been conducted, like the safety test, the equivalent of the crash test dummy, and what are the explicit trade-offs that went into designing these systems. And quite often it's hidden. So if you look at what's happened with Facebook, which runs the sort of algorithm that affects most of us most of the time, Facebook has made explicit decisions about what content they choose to show and what they don't show. But they don't tell us what those decisions are, how they tested whether they were doing them correctly, what process they went through internally to argue to promote things that were yellow rather than things that were purple. And that is all part of not just transparency, but this idea of observability, that we are allowed to see the decisions that they are making and why.
Makes sense. So we have an audience question.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
So the audience asks, do you believe we are at the end of the end or the beginning of the technology age?
I think we are at a really important transition point. In 2011, the world's largest companies were of the last century. It was General Motors and Exxon and ConocoPhillips and General Electric and AT&T. And now it's Apple and Tesla. And there's a whole set of new companies coming through the wings. And although 5 billion of us are connected to the internet, many of us are not connected to the internet at any high speed. Many traditional industries have not transitioned. The realm of replacing industry that has been based on fossil fuels with whatever we figure out how to replace it, and I think it's a number of different exponential technologies, has only just begun. So the transition that we will go through, particularly in the richer countries over the next 15 years, I think will be quite remarkable. And we've done this once before, at a smaller scale, because between 1880 and 1920, Europe and the US went from being rural countries to urban countries. In fact, where my house is today, in 1895 was a farm field, and now it's considered to be relatively central suburban London, and that process took 30 years. So I think we're at the beginning of something.
Thank you. Another audience member asks, do you believe in the Make Tech More Human movement?
Well, I think technology is an intimately human activity. That's where it emerges from. It's what separates us from the non-tool using species, and the fact that we combine our ingenuity and our desire to take shortcuts with culture that allows us to transfer across generations is something that is very, very human. I think what has happened has been, for a variety of different reasons, is that we then gave technology a sort of a mythological force. And we started to say that technology arrives and brilliant men, they were largely men, are the high priests who channel this power from the gods. We call that Silicon Valley. And that had all sorts of benefits that we live with today, but it was very, very disconnected from the way in which we really want to participate in the things that shape our lives. So what I would hope will happen, and what we are starting to see, especially within the entrepreneurial and the startup world, is a wider distribution of where these innovations happen, where people come together to build their technologies, and how these services look different, how they have a Nigerian flavor to them, or a European flavor to them, or an Indonesian flavor to them. Does that make tech more human? I mean, I think it does make it more human. But the importance here is really about participation and making sure that we remind ourselves that the practice of technology is something that we all do.
And so will movements like the, open government and digital government help with this?
I love the word open. It's really exciting. It's a really exciting word. And I think we've seen that open source has really been a tremendously democratizing force, and it's brought tens of millions of people into the industry. We've started to see that open data has helped. For all of its shortcomings, Wikipedia has been provided this sort of open platform for information. I think we've realized now that there's so much benefit in openness and participation, and that so many of the problems that people need to address have to be dealt with locally, that this is a cat that feels like it's increasingly out of the bag, and that's quite exciting, I think.
Yeah. So one of the side effects, all of this technology in our world, and especially the rapid rate at which it increases, is waste. Right? We have a lot of e-waste in addition to all of our regular waste. Do you see exponential technologies having an impact here? Are we just going to create more waste? How are we going to stop this impact, especially with things like the rebound effect, where things get better, we actually use more?
That's right. The rebound effect is also known as my desk. So I'll go and get more boxes or shelves to clear off my desk, and then 2 days later it's just full of junk again. Let me tell you the sort of the positive side of that story, and then figure out how we get to tackle the downside. So the positive side is that many of these technologies are just much more resource efficient. So solar power, genomics, aeroponics produce lettuces using 80% less water. In the UK economy, between 1985 and 2016, the amount of carbon dioxide we needed to put in the atmosphere to generate $1 of GDP declined by a factor of 2.8. So we've already started to figure out how to create economic welfare as measured by GDP with less carbon dioxide pollution. And our ability to simulate things rather than physically build them means that you build drugs more efficiently, you build hydrofoils for boats more efficiently, because you simulate them in software rather than actually building physical prototypes and putting them into the water. So all of that points to us having tools to meet the environmental, economic, and social challenges of the next 30 or 50 years using less and less resources. However, that's less and less resources per output. And if we just stay greedy, then the Jevons paradox, the rebound effect that you described, comes back and bites us. What I think is then that what addresses that is not so much technology, they're enablers, they're sort of necessary conditions. It's the legal and the social and the values frameworks that sit around there. So for example, if our economies and our politicians treated us the way our mothers used to, which was say, don't leave the rubbish lying around in the living room, put it in the bin, then this problem starts to disappear. Right now, we leave our rubbish everywhere. We just pour it up into the atmosphere and we don't worry about it. So there are some simple values that need to be brought back, which is kind of clear up after yourself. And we can call that carbon pricing. We can call it the circular economy. All of these things are kind of political decisions and the societal decisions, but they will be enabled by the technologies.
So we have another audience question. You had this should be our last one. You had a great chapter about the history of automation in your book, how it has oscillated from a job killer to a creator of new jobs. I'm curious how you see automation impact entrepreneurship and the startup movement that has risen in the last decade.
Well, startups love automation. And I tell a story in the book about a guy called Sid who used to work for me. And Sid shows up, second job, our first job out of university, loved climbing. And his job was to maintain our servers. And they used to take him the whole week. And over the course of a few weeks and months, he started to look at the tasks he did every day. And he started to write little scripts, bits of code that automated functions. And in the same time, our business was growing, and the number of servers he had to look after went from about 12 to about 4,000. So it was a big increase. And Sid started to spend only half a day a week doing this. So he managed to automate his job, and he then moved to a better job, right, as a consequence. And the startup community now is really lucky in the sense that so much of what they do is one click. You know, when I built my first startup in 1999, I literally had to go and physically take servers and put them into a data center, like a physical computer. And now there are so many automated tools, from checkout and payment and customer management and invoicing and billing, that you just drag and drop, that it really speeds the time to market. And it's one of the other drivers of the exponential age. And what it does mean is that if you typically look at a startup that's entering a market where there's an incumbent, it has fewer people physically involved, because actually there are tools of automation and you don't have the legacy to contend with. So I think that's an exciting opportunity for entrepreneurs.
Great. So one more question. So will the exponential age continue? What will the children born this year see when they are grandparents?
That's a long time away. To born this year when they're grandparents, so they'll be 60, 2080. You know, I think the underlying trends of decreasing costs for computing, decreasing costs for energy will continue, and we will figure out interesting things that we can do with all of that. With infinite energy, which nuclear fusion might provide by 2080, it's always 30 years away, nuclear fusion. So 2080 is 60 years away. I think we can feel comfortable about that. You would expect us to have cracked lots of the things that are a little bit tricky today, because what becomes hard today actually is really just about energy. And I don't talk about this too much in the book. So I can still see that acceleration continuing, and partly because we are quite far away from the absolute physical limits. A friend of mine who's a physicist said to me, this is going to have to stop at some point because there are only so many protons in the universe. And of course, in some sense, he's right, but we're quite far away from, you know, having to create a mini Uber or Google for every proton in the universe. So I think there's a potential to create a really vibrant and society, but I just need to be clear that the technology is only one aspect of it, right? The politics and social values are really the driving force, and that's what will shape where this technology ends up going.
So it's important for all of us to read your book.
I hope so. I'll just wave it again.
So yes. And so audience, if you'd like to buy the book, please do. And there's a link below. If you can click the green button in the Crowdcast window so you can purchase it. So thank you, Azeem, for this fascinating book and great conversation about the exponential age and exponential technologies and their impact on us. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
And have a great day.